Hi everyone, I'm Stephanie Panay, and in today's podcast I'll be talking about happiness, what it is to be happy, and what some of the mistaken ideas about happiness are. In particular, I'll be drawing on Freud's theory about what happiness is, and I'll be reading from an essay I wrote called Beyond the Body, and it is taken from Volume 2 of Reflections on A Course in Miracles. And we'll also be discussing some workbook lessons, passages from the texts and the manual of A Course in Miracles. Let's get stuck into the essay. Beyond the Body. "I've been to the other side, mate, and there's nothing there," said Australian media magnate Kerry Packer after a heart attack left him clinically dead for 6 minutes. There's nothing there. There's no one there. Packer was a ruthless businessman, as was his father before him. Bred in an era when a killer instinct was par for the course in business, and the meaning of life found in the motto, "He who dies with the most toys wins." Packer's near-death experience was a motive for the way he lived. There's no life outside the body. In contrast, two of the strongest themes permeating A Course in Miracles are that we're not alone, we have an internal teacher, and that we're not a body, our interests pitted against everyone else's. The idea that we are nothing more than bodies is why Freud's outlook was essentially pessimistic. Freud's drive theory held that aggressiveness, competitiveness, selfishness, hate, is a natural and inescapable human characteristic, and that we need to be able to express it to some degree in order to be happy. But he also knew that a society couldn't function if its members were allowed to express aggression whenever they wanted and to its full extent. In Freud's world, the price of a civilised society is the individual's happiness. And here is a quote from Civilisations and Its Discontents by Freud. "If civilization imposes such great sacrifices, not only on man's sexuality, but also on his aggressivity, we are in a better position to understand why it is so hard for him to feel happy in it. Primitive man was actually better off, because his drives were not restricted. Yet this was counterbalanced by the fact that he had little certainty of enjoying his good fortune for long. Civilized man has traded in a portion of his chances of happiness for a certain measure of security." End of quote. And so, according to Freud, we can never be truly happy, our instinctual aggressive drives being thwarted. Freud therefore concludes that while psychoanalysis can help a great deal with neurotic misery, related to nervous disorders, clinical depression and the like, it can do nothing for what he calls common unhappiness, the natural condition of a biological creature always in conflict with its instinctual drives. Subtitle: The Narcissism of Small Differences. Because aggression plays a central role in Freud's theory of human nature and happiness, he came up with several ideas about how we could express it in relatively harmless ways. Sublimation was one such method. It involved channeling aggressive impulses into socially acceptable forms, such as creating a work of art, for example, or participating in sports that require some control and skill. This also relates to Freud's theory of catharsis, that aggression is a force that needs to be let out, so it's best to release it. That's what catharsis means. Otherwise, a head full of steam will cause our lid to pop. According to this model, it can also be cathartic to focus on and give voice to our dislike of other people. This leads to one of Freud's most disturbing ideas, the narcissism of small differences. Freud proposed that members of a group will develop more affection for each other and cooperate more if they have outsiders they can hate. Freud called this growth in self-love narcissism, but he saw it as a good thing. He thought it represented a healthy process that guards against too much repression of aggressiveness and so contributes to happiness. Quote, "It is clearly not easy for people to forego the satisfaction of their tendency to aggression. To do so makes them feel uneasy. One should not belittle the advantage that is enjoyed by a fairly small cultural circle which is that it allows the aggressive drive an outlet in the form of hostility to outsiders. It is always possible to bind quite large numbers of people together in love, provided that others are left out as targets for aggression. I called this phenomenon the narcissism of small differences. Not that the name does much to explain it. It can be seen as a convenient and relatively innocuous way of satisfying the tendency to aggression and facilitating solidarity within the community. End of quote. Not only did Freud think that excluding some people from our love contributed to happiness, he felt that trying to love everyone contributes to illness. This is why Freud took issue with the biblical commandment, love thy neighbour as thyself. For Freud, trying to obey the love command makes us sick or neurotic because it leads to too much denial and repression of our aggressive nature. In Civilisation and Its Discontents, Freud accuses the commandment of being too severe in not taking into account our natural tendency towards aggression, nor that some people don't deserve our love if they treat us poorly, for example. If we try and follow the commandment, all we can gain is some feeling of moral superiority for being so warm-hearted towards everyone, but ultimately we'll suffer from neurotic unhappiness. And that, of course, is all in Freud's view, but we'll get into the course and its perspectives shortly. Subtitle: The Exceptions. There are many examples of people acting in ways counter to Freud's theory of aggression. People who, in dire circumstances, had the opportunity to fend for themselves at the cost of someone else, a stranger, but who nonetheless risked some of their own comfort and security for them. This was the case according to psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl, who wrote about his experience in a concentration camp in his book Man's Search for Meaning, where, from a purely biological or sociological point of view, conditions might predict someone becoming aggressive and selfish. Frankl observed the opposite on enough occasions to conclude that no matter what the circumstances, we are still able to make a choice as to how we respond. Freud himself also noted that there were some individuals, highly esteemed, who didn't operate from a competitive, aggressive place, and who seemed to possess a genuine positive regard for humanity as a whole. One such person was Romain Rolland, a French novelist and essayist who was strongly influenced by the Vedanta philosophy of India. The written correspondence between Freud and Rolland shows considerable respect and affection for each other. Indeed, Freud begins Civilisation and Its Discontents with the following reference to Rolland. Quote, "There are some individuals who are venerated by their contemporaries, but whose greatness rests on qualities and achievements that are quite foreign to the aims and ideals of the many." End of quote. In other words, there are some esteemed people who don't operate from a desire for power, success, or wealth. Quote, "One of these outstanding men corresponds with me and in his letters calls himself my friend. I sent him a little piece of mine that treats religion as an illusion, and in his reply he said that he wholly agreed with my view of religion, but regretted that I had failed to appreciate the real source of religiosity. This was a particular feeling of which he himself was never free, which he had found confirmed by many others, and which he assumed was shared by millions, a feeling that he was inclined to call a sense of eternity, a feeling of something limitless, unbounded, as it were, oceanic. This feeling was a purely subjective fact, not an article of faith. This opinion of my esteemed friend caused me no small difficulty. I can discover no trace of this oceanic feeling in myself." End of quote. The oceanic feeling that Rolland speaks of isn't at all related to religious dogma or ritual, but to an experience of connectedness and boundlessness, an absence of us, they, and therefore of any animosity or disquiet. True to form, rather than consider that perhaps there's more to life than what meets the eye, Freud goes on to suggest that such oceanic feelings must be regressive. They occur when reality causes us to flee to an earlier developmental experience, when we hadn't yet differentiated ourselves psychologically from our mother. That's Freud all over. Freud's is a pessimistic theory. We shouldn't try to curb our aggressiveness too much because it will make us neurotic. Indeed, we should indulge our hate a little bit because this strengthens the bonds within our select group and makes us feel good temporarily. Again, this is all in Freud's theory. But ultimately, we can never be truly happy because we have to limit the expression of our aggressive drives in order to live in a secure society. Common unhappiness is the price of civilization. Sorry. Freud's steadfastness in maintaining a biological outlook towards the totality of human experience could be attributed to an unconscious attraction to spirituality, a case of reaction formation, to use a Freudian term. Though his rejection of otherworldliness was clear, he nonetheless felt a strong attraction for Rolland, as seen in this passage from a letter he wrote soon before undergoing another medical procedure for cancer. Quote, "Approaching life's inevitable end, reminded of it by yet another operation, and aware that I am unlikely to see you again, I may confess to you that I have rarely experienced that mysterious attraction of one human being for another as vividly as I have with you. It is somehow bound up, perhaps, with the awareness of our being so different." End of quote. From a Jungian point of view, we could say that Freud was spellbound by his shadow, a repressed but essential part of himself that was calling for integration, and this call was evidenced by his attraction to Rolland. Ultimately, however, Freud couldn't come to grips with the idea that two distinct motivations can exist within us, one linked to biological needs and our identification as a body, and a transcendent one, based on an entirely different identification and perception of reality. Since the latter can't be comprehended by the intellect, which was a process Freud insisted on, but can only be experienced, we need what the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard called a leap of faith, a willingness to base our life on principles that put us in accord with our transcendent nature, of which we initially have limited experience. Subtitle: A Course in Miracles, the Light of Hope. According to the Course's mythology, this world was made as an attack on God. It represents a monumental act of thumbing our nose at God's oneness and choosing an experience of separation instead. In the ego's world, we can be special, different, and triumphant. We can attack, hate, be selfish, suspicious, vengeful, manipulative, greedy, envious, despondent, depressed, anxious, resigned, and terrified, all because we identify as a body, separate from God and from each other. Freud saw the dark side of human nature, and he brought to light the many defences we employ to protect us from guilt. Defences such as denial, repression, and projection. His solutions to guilt, however, lay firmly within the dream. His overarching concern could be stated as, how can we express our aggression in ways that are socially acceptable and relatively harmless? Or, how does man, the animal, make peace with the demands of civilization? For Freud, the human being's aggressive drives meant that we can't truly be a friend to people whose worldly needs appear at odds with our own, that we're destined to be pitted against each other. Focusing on the body, the psychological and physical body, he became well acquainted with the darkness of the ego here being our false separated self. But Freud's one-sidedness means his is a closed system. It starts with us as bodies and ends with us as bodies. We come into the world on our own and we leave the world on our own. This is the world's curriculum, what it was designed to teach, that we are not as God created us. Oneness is an illusion and separation the reality. It's a quote from the Manual of A Course in Miracles. Everyone who follows the world's curriculum, and everyone here does follow it until he changes his mind, teaches solely to convince himself that he is what he is not. Herein is the purpose of the world. What else then would its curriculum be? Into this hopeless and closed learning situation, which teaches nothing but despair and death, God sends his teachers. And as they teach his lessons of joy and hope, their learning finally becomes complete. End of quote. Joy and hope. They're not words you'll find in Freud's literature. But as mystics across the ages have attested, joy is indeed possible as we no longer look to the ephemeral for meaning, security, and happiness. Quote from the Course. Can you imagine what a state of mind without illusions is? How it would feel? Try to remember when there was a time, perhaps a minute, maybe even less, when nothing came to interrupt your peace, when you were certain you were loved and safe. Then try to picture what it would be like to have that moment be extended to the end of time and to eternity. Then let the sense of quiet that you felt be multiplied 100 times and then be multiplied another 100 more. And now you have a hint, not more than just the faintest intimation of the state your mind will rest in when the truth has come. End of quote. Subtitle: Denying the Denial of Truth. The world teaches us that we are a body, our peace vulnerable to circumstances beyond our control. The Course teaches us that all distress comes from a decision to deny the truth of God's oneness and identify with the ego, and separation instead. This decision roots our attention in problems of the world and leads us to feel victimised by what goes on around us. We see ourselves and everyone else as bodies, quote, mindless and capable of complete corruption and decay, end of quote. That's the Course's definition of faithlessness. And here's another quote from the Course. Do not overlook our earlier statement that faithlessness leads straight to illusions, for faithlessness is the perception of a brother as a body, and the body cannot be used for purposes of union. Your faithlessness has thus opposed the Holy Spirit's purpose and brought illusions, centred on the body, to stand between you. End of quote. The Holy Spirit's purpose is healing, which means remembering who we all are as part of God's oneness. Always practical, the Course doesn't suggest that we try to see ourselves and others without a body or to deny our bodily experience, our pain and pleasure, but rather that we ask ourselves whether we want to see someone else as sinless. Another way of putting this is to ask ourselves if we're willing to see the call for help behind someone's attack and their choice for the ego as a mistake rather than a sin. By our lack of condemnation, which would be evident in our attitude, not necessarily our behaviour or words, we remind them of their innocence, that what their body has done has had no effect on their reality as part of God's oneness. And in so doing, we remind ourselves of our own innocence, which is why no one is healed alone. Healing, then, is our shared interest. And in remembering this, we help to loosen our identification as bodies in competition with each other, either for resources or the high moral ground. This is how we meet someone without our specialness needs impinging on the encounter, demanding to be met, and this is how we can meet everyone from the same place of love. All of this stands in stark contrast to Freud's prescription for a happy life. In relation to the narcissism of small differences, for example, the momentary sense of satisfaction we experience in dishing out a so-called controlled portion of hatred towards outsiders is destined to come back on us in the form of guilt for our attack. Also, because we are all one on the level of the mind outside time and space, what we say about one person, we are saying about the whole. Quote, although you can love the sonship only as one, you can perceive it as fragmented. It is impossible, however, to see something in part of it that you will not attribute to all of it. That is why attack is never discreet and why it must be relinquished entirely. End of quote. Anger isn't an instinct, a reflexive action. It can certainly feel like one, but it isn't. Everything we feel stems from an interpretation of things, and that interpretation will be coloured by whether we have chosen the ego or the Holy Spirit as our teacher. And just as all expressions of love, not the ego's special exclusive love, but the Holy Spirit's all-inclusive love, are maximal, all expressions of hate are maximal too. Though we might limit ourselves to expressing a mild form of anger towards someone, any amount of anger affirms the same content, that the world of the ego is real, that we are a body, and that we have destroyed love with a capital L. We then need to project the guilt for our act of treachery out and see someone else as the wrongdoer, hence our attack. Quote from the Course, "Only the self-accused condemn." Real, lasting happiness, therefore, doesn't come from managing a precarious balance between expressing enough aggression to let off steam and bind a distinct group of people together, and limit aggression so as to maintain a secure society. How could such a balance ever be perfected? Instead, lasting happiness is achieved by never justifying our anger, in the recognition that we are never angered by a fact, but by our interpretation of it. That is what helps lift us above the battleground of bodies, to the mind where we can choose to look at things differently with the help of our internal teacher, what the Course calls the appointed friend. Subtitle: The appointed friend. The ego gets its life from the very thought of being alone, having come from a wish for separateness. Therefore, to perceive ourselves as alone is to perceive ourselves as guilty, and vice versa. Quote from the Course, "To be alone is to be guilty, for to experience yourself as alone is to deny the oneness of the Father and his Son, and thus to attack reality." And here's another quote from the Course, "This world is but the dream that you can be alone." End of quotes. How could we be happy then if we believe we have been left to our own devices to get by? Opening our minds to the influence of something transcendent, a symbol of love that's not of this world, such as the Holy Spirit, sets us on the only road to true happiness. The Holy Spirit is a symbol of our self, capital S self, meaning spiritual self, and the answer to all the darkness that we perceive. Quote from the Course, "Any mistake can be corrected if truth be left to judge it. And truth will remind us that there is nothing to fear. We avail ourselves of help when we ask to look at a situation through the eyes of peace and not judgment. That's what an internal teacher helps us with." The section in the Course called The Appointed Friend speaks of the importance of this relationship with the Holy Spirit. When we are not deciding with our capital F friend, we have identified ourselves as a body, deficient and separate, different and special. We'll feel needy, wanting to be liked, respected, preferred or protected, and we'll believe that special people, such as our partners, parents, siblings and friends, can or should fulfill our needs. We will be preoccupied with our own voice, the internal chatter in our head, and what we've identified as an external problem will seem overly complicated, larger than life. And ultimately, investments in people, careers, projects, activities, etc., to give us security and happiness, keeps us feeling alone. Quote from the Course, "Lead not your little life in solitude with one illusion," meaning specialness, "as your only friend. Without him," capital H, meaning the Holy Spirit, "you are friendless. Seek not another friend to take his place. There is no other friend." End of quote. No one is our friend when we are identified with our ego and specialness needs. We demand too much of those around us. We demand that they give us the sense of wholeness, comfort and love that only connecting with our appointed friend can provide. Built on a thought of conflict with God, the ego thrives on conflict, on seeing separate interests and opposition. So when we listen to it, we'll perceive even our nearest and dearest as enemies. If our investment in people and things to satisfy our neediness was redirected towards establishing communication with our internal teacher, then we'd experience the love and communion we really seek. An all-inclusive love that doesn't discriminate and thus reminds us of our ever-present home. The promise of the world that we will find happiness in an intimate relationship, a fulfilling career, or making lots of money is really a form of propaganda that keeps the ego thriving and obscures the Holy Spirit's voice. And when we believe that something in the world can make us happy or make us sad, we are saying the world is real, and so is separation and sin. Quote from the Course: anything in this world that you believe is good and valuable and worth striving for can hurt you and will do so, not because it has the power to hurt, but just because you have denied it is but an illusion and made it real. And it is real to you. It is not nothing. And through its perceived reality has entered all the world of sick illusions. All belief in sin, in power of attack, in hurt and harm, in sacrifice and death has come to you. For no one can make one illusion real and still escape the rest. End of quote. It's not what you do, but who you do it with. Our relationships, careers, existence wouldn't be fulfilling unless we give them the purpose of forgiveness, thereby not using them as a substitute for a relationship with our appointed friend. As Workbook Lesson 66 points out, we need to remember that forgiveness, our function, and happiness are one. Quote, you have surely noticed an emphasis throughout our recent lessons on the connection between fulfilling your function and achieving happiness. This is because you do not really see the connection. Yet there is more than just a connection between them. They are the same. Their forms are different, but their content is completely one. End of quote. Our natural state is happiness, and it has nothing to do with fulfilling our specialness needs, cathartic expression of anger, or excluding people from our love. It's about remembering who we are as part of God's oneness. We do this by watching out for a one or the other mentality and by deciding that we'd prefer to be happy. And so, with the help of our appointed friend, we can look at our thoughts, recognise their purpose, and choose again. This is the Course's path to real, lasting happiness. And that is the end of the essay. Thank you very much for listening. Tune in again. Bye.